Hello, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, doctors. Welcome to RWD Vet Academy channel, and thank you for your attention. My name is Janik, and I'm the sales in charge of African market. A friendly reminder that our webinar has been accredited by the South African Veterinary Council. To earn CPD points, you must participate in the webinar for at least half an hour. Please ensure you join the webinar and stay engaged for the required duration to qualify for the CPD points. Now, let's begin our webinar. Allow me to introduce our company before we dive into the agenda. RWD is a life science company focusing on animal health. Under more than 20 years history, we try our best to provide comprehensive service in anesthesia management and ventilation in practice, dental health care, and recovery option. RWD products are trusted by over 10,000 pet medical institutions in 130 countries. In addition to providing veterinarians with superior products, we also looking up to spread knowledge from experienced doctors. So we launched this channel for medical technique communication. For tonight, the topic is how to get the most out of your anesthetic machine. We are honored to invite Dr. Kenneth to share his knowledge and experience of disease and take us to explore more treatment methods. Now, please allow me to give an introduction for our today's speaker, Dr. Kenneth. Dr. Kenneth graduated with a BVSc from the University of Pretoria in 1995. After graduating, he joined small animal practice in Johannesburg for 2 years, then returned to the University of Pretoria. In 2000, he obtained a med vet and held the position of senior lecturer in anesthesiology at the university. In 2004, he rejoined private practice before starting his own referral practice in anesthesiology, pain management, and critical care. Dr. Kenneth chaired the faculty ethics committee before, then a member of the Senate Committee for Research Ethics and Integrity, and the Animal Use and Care Committee of the University of Pretoria. Now, currently serves on the AUCC and the Ethics Review Group of the AVA. He is also a member of the Education Committee and the Standard Committee of South African Veterinary Council. All right, I will pass the time to Dr. Kenneth. Dear doctors, if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type in the chatting room. Dr. Kenneth will answer after his presentation. Now, let's welcome Dr. Kenneth. Doctor, please kindly turn on your microphone.
That I need to do. Thank you. Thanks so much for that very, very kind introduction. And it's always an honor and a privilege to talk and to talk to my colleagues. So thanks very much for giving me that opportunity. And thanks, as I say, thank you very much to RWD for this opportunity to talk tonight. We're going to talk about the anesthetic machine. And I wanted to start with a little scenario that all of us quite often face. And it's a middle to elderly age little dog that needs a dental. Dental will most probably take us somewhere in the region of about an hour to do. But actually, we have a whole lot of choices to make at the moment. What are we going to do? How are we going to do the anesthetic? But I also want you to start thinking, how have you costed this procedure? Are you running a special on dentals? And so it's a fixed cost for the client, which means if the anesthetic costs you more or it costs you less, you get to absorb that cost if it's more expensive. If it's cheaper, you get to make more profit out of it. And these type of choices are actually choices we make every single day as we go through it, but we often don't think about the economics. If the client's paying, by the way, does it matter what it costs? They're paying for everything that you use. it doesn't matter because they're going to pick up the bill. But when the practice is, so what about people who work in welfare, for example? How do you make these decisions? Because there, you're dependent on donations or charitable donations to, in actual fact, fund your entire clinic. And so where you can save money actually becomes valuable. But it's not only about economics, it's also about our patients and safety. It's about our staff and the environment that we live in. So there's a big issue for us to think about in these choices. And I started by giving us some choices to start to think about. Anesthetic circuits. I've chosen a way to put us somewhere roundabout. Do we use a circle system? Do we use a semi-closed circuit? Do we go for a non-rebreathing circuit, like a T-tube or a Mapleson's type system? What's our source of oxygen? An oxygen cylinder or oxygen concentrators? What drugs are we going to use? And these choices are often made. Sometimes we have protocols which will deal with the drugs we're going to use. But how do we maintain this patient? If you don't have an anesthetic machine, you may be doing total intravenous anesthesia, for example, or we're just going to do total intravenous anesthesia anyway, or we're going to do inhalation anesthetics. Which agent do we choose? Halothane, isoflurane, sevoflurane, desflurane, for example. So we need to work through these options and these choices to decide what we're going to do and how we're going to go about doing it. That's there. So you may have an anesthetic machine that looks like one of these that are out there. Right on the far left-hand side is a really, really simple old anesthetic machine. It's got a charcoal absorber on it, but comes out of sort of the period of time, by the way, just so that you know, somewhere around about the 60s or 70s. Many of you have got equipment from human hospitals. That's the middle machine. It's an anesthetic machine that was used quite a long time ago in a human hospital. They get scrapped and replaced with more modern anesthetic machines, and often they land up somehow in veterinary clinics that is out there. Or you could have bought a purpose-built anesthetic machine like the RWD machine that you see right on the right-hand side of the picture. What does your machine look like? Well, how it looks is important to some extent, but how it functions is perhaps the most important thing for us to think about. And what do your circuits and your connectors look like? And the reason I've started to put this up here is because these are cracks and holes. They leaks. And so the first part of my talk is going to talk a lot about leaks and why it's important for us to worry about what leaks, why does it leak, and what does it mean for us, by the way. But having good quality connectors and tubes that we use is actually very, very important. How many of you leak test your anesthetic machines? This just comes from a soda lime canister. The bubbles are there so that you can see a leak. But we replace soda lime regularly, and if we don't look after those seals and protect those seals, they get destroyed. One, by the soda lime, which we'll talk a little bit about more later, or because we're very careless in how we replace those seals. So it's one of the most common places that an anesthetic machine actually leaks from, because we replace the soda lime. Do we check it? Because if the gas is leaving, and that's your inhalation anesthetic, it's not going to your patient. It's leaving into the environment. And your patient's not getting the full benefit of the anesthetic agents we're trying to deliver, nor the oxygen, and we're going to dilute those out as well because of these leaks. And that's perhaps how the anesthetist lands up sleeping on the job, all because of leaks, bad connectors, and anesthetic machines. So we need to check our anesthetic machine to make sure it's sealed. Now, hopefully I'm going to make an argument. One is because of the environment and how we pollute the environment, also how we get exposed, occupational safety and exposure of staff to anesthetic agents, but as well as maintaining anesthetic depth. And people often ask me about problems that their patients don't sleep. Well, one of the leading causes for that is leaks in circuits. And it's important to go and check that they leak. But I thought I'd show you this, because if we're using a lot of anesthetic agents, we're polluting the environment. And desflurane is possibly the worst agent as far as the environment goes. But 1 hour of surgery is the same as driving about 200 to 400 kilometers. You use sevoflurane, by the way, it's about 5 to 10 kilometers. And I'll show you isoflurane in the next slide. But we have to think about the environment, by the way. Under the Kyoto Agreement that was concluded many years ago, most of our anesthetic agents, by the way, are hydrofluorinated, are hydrocarbons. They do pollute the environment. They can destroy the ozone layer, and they can persist for very, very long. And part of desflurane's problem is it can persist in the environment for thousands of years and maintain that greenhouse gas effect. Because at some stage, if we don't control it, by the way, somebody else will do that job for us. It could be an environmentalist or the Department of Environmental Affairs who says, no, we're no longer going to pollute the environment with anesthetic agents. These drugs are out. So if we can be prudent and show that we're doing our best to prevent pollution, it puts us in a far, far stronger position. There we are, just to give you a rough idea, using MAC values, you can see there SIVO and ISO, fairly short car journeys at 6.5 and 14 kilometers, DES out there at 320. Nitrous oxide, which we don't commonly use in South Africa at all, is actually a greenhouse gas as well and contributes nearly 100 kilometers of driving. So something for us to think about is that environment as well from our leaking machine, because if your machine's leaking, these gases are escaping into the environment. And we can stop that by just checking our machine. This was an article written a good couple of years ago by Alan Clyde that's out there, who worked out that if you started doing good practice in anesthetics, making sure your anesthetic machine seals, doing low flow anesthesia, you could retire with an extra 16 million US dollars. Isn't that amazing? Because of the effects of compounding. That's a hell of a lot of money. And that was based on what the work was done at the University of California, Davis, where he was working at the time. So it's money. And we're going to talk about both sides of money, because buying new equipment can be expensive, and how do we pay for it, because that's important. But also what it costs our clients, or where we're absorbing the costs, how it takes our profits away. So the first thing is, by the way, find the leak. And that's from Afroc Safe Leak Tester. All it is soapy solution to make bubbles. And that's how we go about finding leaks. But in order for us to be able to do that and to find these leaks, by the way, we need to do a positive pressure leak test. And to do one every day, or especially once you've changed circuits, you change the soda lime, change the reservoir bag. The next of reservoir bags are another common place of leaks, by the way. We can start to improve our anesthetic practices that are there. You can create your own little device like I've done, mainly because if you've got the first machine, the old machine that's out there, it doesn't have a pressure gauge. So you can use a pressure gauge, and I'll show you how to do it without a pressure gauge as well, by the way. And what you do is you generate a positive pressure in that circuit, and you maintain a pressure of ideally somewhere between 20 to 30 centimeters of water that's there. So this is the RW machine. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture on the left, you'll see a nice distended reservoir bag. This itself has a little hole in the side of the block where the one-way valves are, so that you can put your tube into it, which gives you that seal. And you inflate the bag and you let it hold that pressure. And I've always used somewhere in the region of about 30 seconds to a minute. And as long as it holds the pressure for that long, then you know that your circuit at least passes a positive pressure leak test, which means the leak would be incredibly small if there was one. But if you don't have a pressure gauge, you can still do the leak test. Close off the Y piece, close off the pop-off valve, because you have to do that. And in the case of these more modern machines, by the way, they've limited the maximum pressure that you can generate, in this case to 30 centimeters of water. Our old pop-off valves, if you close them, they close. So you can generate a pressure of 100 centimeters or potentially up to about 340 kilopascals, because that's what high pressure oxygen comes at, which will blow your patient's lungs. But you fill the reservoir bag so that all the little crinkles in the bag's nicely filled, that all the little crinkles in the sides of the bag are gone. Turn the gas flow rate off and see that those little things, because as air pressure is lost, you'll see little crinkles come back into the bag. Then you know it's leaking. And how do you find that leak? Well, you turn on your flow meter until the bag keeps that same pressure. Is that 100 mils a minute, or is it 2 liters a minute, or 5 liters a minute, for example? And then you go and check every single connection. or where the pipes attach. I usually start with the soda lime canister and the reservoir bag because those are the most common ones, by the way. And then you go through each connection, each piece of pipe. Pipes can get holes in them, by the way. I don't know whether people stick needles into them or get bored, but I've seen some interesting holes in bags. Recently, I had an anaesthetic machine, by the way, where it leaked from actually where the vaporizer was mounted. So that's very rare, though, that would happen. And that's how you do a positive pressure leak test. And you want to do one, because if your machine fails a positive pressure leak test, you're going to have anaesthetic problems. You're either not going to deliver enough anesthetic agent to your patient and they're going to keep waking up, for example, or they're not going to get the required amount of oxygen. So we need to sort those leaks out. What's more sensitive, by the way, is a negative pressure leak test. In a negative pressure leak test, you actually don't need to close the pop-off valve because you're going to suck it closed, and you suck all the air out of the circuit and you keep a negative pressure in that circuit. And so a negative pressure leak test is just far more sensitive. In terms of a leak test, you can detect a couple of mils a minute of a leak in a circuit. But it is another way of testing it. And if you look at this machine very carefully, you'll notice that the leak test's done, but the common gas outlet is not connected. Some anesthetic machines have what I call a dump valve, but it prevents a patient from breathing against a negative pressure. So that valve opens if negative pressure generates in the circuit. So if you try to suck all the air out of the circuit, in actual fact, that dump valve opens. So it's to ensure that your patient has air to breathe, that they don't breathe against a closed circuit. So not all machines can actually have a negative pressure leak test done on them. Some machines can and some machines can't. So you just need to know your machine. But if you include the bit that connects to the common gas outlet, by the way, you can in actual fact do a negative pressure leak test. That is then. As I say, it's just far more sensitive than a positive pressure. But to get good clinical use, by the way, your machine purely needs to pass a positive pressure leak test that's there. And that's just showing you the pressure on the manometer that's there to give you an idea of how to do that negative pressure leak test. By the way, for some people, it means out with the old and you're going to have to get a new machine. There are many people with old machines, and Mr. Cornish was always really good at doing it. He machined his own parts all the time, and he's got old Imperial parts. Some machines still use BSP standard or British Imperial standard for their components. Other people have got modern machines, so it's not always possible to fix them. Some of the soda lime canisters that were produced many years ago, we just can't get them anymore. So you've got to look at what you've got and does it work? Some of you have got good quality vaporizers and just need other bits and pieces to go with it. But it's something for you to think about. And so from here, I want to try and talk about why we want to do it and what are the economic implications of getting a better machine for us, and how do we use our circuits to the best advantage of the patient. Because we have a number of circuits that are available to us, by the way, is the non-rebreathing circuits that are down on the left-hand side. So they've got a T-tube and a veins type circuit that's there, as well as a circle system. And some of you will be familiar with the top right-hand circuit, which is what I know is a universal F, where your inspiratory and expiratory limbs are one inside each other, which does help, by the way, with some heat conservation, because as the air flows in, it's heated by the expired air. But we have those circular components, which usually has a soda lime canister, some one-way valve somewhere in the circuit, the pop-off valve, and a rebreathing bag. And these two major types of circuits function very, very differently. So if we look at a T-tube, by the way, that gas flow is 2 times minute volume. And I'll show you now in the next couple of slides why we need such a high gas flow rate. Our 7.5 kilo dog, you work out that he's breathing at about 10 breaths per minute. It just makes my maths a lot easier. If I can put it to you that way. So we've got a 7.5 kilo. He's going to use about 750 mils is the basal amount. And we double that because we need to get rid of the expired gases. So we're looking at a gas flow of about 1.5 to 2 liters a minute. That's there. And the reason that we need that is that a T-tube is a non-rebreathing circuit. So we fill it up with the fresh gas and the isoflurane. that we're using. The whole circuit's filled up like that. Our patient breathes in, he breathes in the fresh gas with isoflurane, and then he breathes out. And the first bit of gas he breathes out is dead space gas, by the way. It didn't participate in gaseous exchange. It still contains 2% isoflurane. If you're using 100% pure oxygen, 100% pure oxygen, it hasn't changed. And some circuits like the Bain circuit or the Humphrey ADE circuit, for example, will reutilize part of that dead space gas. So you can use a slightly lower gas flow rate for that circuit. As our patient continues to breathe out, then the alveolar gas comes. And that participates in gaseous exchange. So instead of containing 2% iso, it now contains 1% isoflurane. That's there, plus some CO2 that our patient breathed out, and he's, of course, taken some oxygen out of that gas. And we rely on this high gas flow rate to then push all that air through the system and out the circuit, so that when the patient takes his next breath, he breathes in fresh gas again. And that's why the gas flow rate is so high. So we're using the fresh gas flow to, in actual fact, clear all the alveolar gas out of that circuit. And we don't reutilize any of it. And that means that gas, as the arrows indicate, go out into the environment that's out there. Just remember, if you've got leaking connectors, by the way, all those other connectors that leak, yes, gas is going to escape. And if you close the pop-off valve slightly, which often happens, people do that because the reservoir bag doesn't really fill very well, so you try and fill it. It just means more gas leaks out higher up in the circuit. It doesn't mean your patient is getting more anesthetic gas, because our pop-off valve is right here where this arrow is by the dead space gas, often, or in that part of the circuit. So in other words, it's clearing all the dead space gas that's out there. So how does this look economically for you? And this is just based on one of our wholesalers' prices for isoflurane and sevoflurane. So they're 250 ml bottles, just so that you know. Inspired percentage is 100%, because that's what most of you practitioners out there will be doing, is a high percentage of oxygen. Now, fresh gas flow rate is 2 liters a minute. And then you'll notice, what's the cost per hour? Well, isoflurane is going to cost us at that rate about 58 Rand, call it 59 Rand an hour. And our sevoflurane sitting there at about 129, 130 Rand an hour. That's what it costs us. We don't reutilize that gas. It's all going out into the environment. And therefore, you'll notice how many CO2 equivalents, looking at the greenhouse gas effect, just so that you know, is what's done on the other side there. So isoflurane at 9.3 and 3.8 for sevoflurane, that's there. So you can roughly see what that's costing you. So T-tubes are running, depending on which gas, using between 130 Rand an hour and about 60 Rand an hour, just as a rough estimate for you. Remember these costs, but I'll show them again to you a little bit later on in my talk, just to remind you when we compare all of this together. So why do we use these non-rebreathing circuits? Well, part of that is because we said, well, there's resistance in circle systems, there's valves, there's soda lime to breathe through. But if you look at it, by the way, small patients can't cope with dead space. And I'll explain that to you over the next couple of slides. But we create dead space iatrogenically. And this is just to show you what happens. We buy an ED tube, but we should cut it off once it's positioned at the correct depth, which is just in front of the thoracic inlet. So we should be able to palpate the end of the ET tube just in front of the chest, and we should cut the excess off, because that's iatrogenic dead space, by the way. We've created it. But we tend not to cut our tubes because, well, what happens if it's a bigger dog? What happens if it's a smaller dog? But if you cut some of your tubes, then you just use the short tubes on dogs that require short tubes, and the long tubes on dogs that require longer tubes that are there. But dead space is something that harms small patients very quickly. And why does it do that? So just remember, your tidal volume is made up of dead space and alveolar ventilation. And this is really just proposing that your tidal volume is 50 mils, so it's a small dog, about 5 kilos. The dead space is about 16 mils in a normal patient that's awake. That's the tracheal, the trachea, the large bronchi, the bifurcations that are there. And our alveolar ventilation is about 34 mils. We add a whole extra piece of pipe. It's easy to add 10 mils, by the way. dead space doesn't change inside the lungs, and we add 10 mils because of a long ET tube, a right-angled connector, and a little bit of extra tube onto there just because it's convenient for us. And what do? We start to reduce alveolar ventilation. And the reality is all anesthetic agents are respiratory depressants. So you can easily halve tidal volume ventilation by giving an anesthetic. And if you've added all those extra pipes onto it, effectively alveolar ventilation goes. And with that, the only way a small patient can compensate to try and increase minute volume is they increase their respiratory rate, because they can't, or not that effective at increasing depth anymore. And what happens? As you increase respiratory rate, tidal volume drops usually even further. And so you enter a cycle. What happens? Well, alveolar ventilation suffers. That means you don't take up your anesthetic agent. And so your patient doesn't sleep very well. So we need to look after headspace. But we can also make a case, both for non-rebreathing circuits in very small patients, by the way. And some people have said, well, you know, you can use a non-rebreathing on 5 or 6 kilos, but maybe we should only really consider those for very, very small patients. By the way, then the gas flow rate does come, because we can use circle systems, and this just comes from the University of Natal and Stellenbosch University that was out there, where they looked at in South Africa in breathing patients, that you can use circle systems in pediatric patients. And Colin Dunlop made this case many years ago to say, well, we can use circle systems. We just have to be careful about how we use them, because small spheres can actually generate more pressure for the same amount of tension than a large adult can. So the larger your chest diameter, actually your ability to generate negative pressure decreases. And I'll always just use this as an example. When a baby is born, its first couple of breaths, by the way, can be taken at a negative pressure of close on a meter. You try and now go below 30 centimeters below the pool surface and try and breathe in. It becomes almost impossible. So as we've grown up, our ability to work against that resistance actually decreases as our chest increases in size. And that's just Purcell's law taking place. So you have to generate a lot more tension in your muscles to actually get a higher negative pressure. So small patients can actually cope with resistance, but they fatigue very easily if you push them at high respiratory rates. And that's why it's reasonable to consider a circle system for a small patient. All we do is we change the adult circuits for pediatric or neonatal circuits, so they have smaller and smaller volumes, which helps them cope with the relative dead space that exists to open the valves that are further away in the circuit. So if you think about it this way, to get the valves to open, you need to move X number of mils of air to create a negative pressure across it, usually about 1 or 2 centimeters of water. Once the valves are open, by the way, the air flows. So all you have to do is generate that negative pressure, get the valves to open, and then the air will flow. And if you've placed the soda lime canister on the expiratory side of the circuit, all you do is you generate some PEEP as the patient expires. And that, of course, is in actual fact made. And most modern machines are designed that way. So that's useful. Usually the pop-off valve is just before the soda lime canister, just so that you know that is there. And the reason for doing that is, why waste the soda lime if you're going to exhaust air out of the circuit? So if you can exhaust the air, you don't need to remove that CO2, and it leaves through the pop-off valve before the rest of the air flows through the soda lime that's there. So if we look at our gas flow rates, by the way, for a circle system that's out there, it's 10 times body mass roughly. That's there to get an idea, and 3 times that for a semi-closed circuit. So if we have a look at our patient, by the way, and again here, if we use a semi-closed circuit, that would be about 225 mils a minute we would use, and the prices are exactly the same. You can see our cost now, which was about nearly 60 Rand, 58 Rand, goes down to 6 Rand 59 an hour. And our other cost was about 130 Rand for the SIVO, is now down to 14 Rand 57. And you can see the drop in environmental exposure that's there. We looked at a closed circuit, by the way, so theoretically we could use 75 mils a minute. And this is where, by the way, having a good vaporizers. So if you look at old Mark IIIs, which a lot of people have a meter Mark IIIs, they calibrate it down to a flow of about 500 mils a minute. But modern Mark V vaporizers and so on often calibrated to flows as low as 50 mils a minute. So this is quite feasible. Now our cost drops down to R2.20 an hour for ISO. So it's dropped now by about a third. And the same has happened for sevoflurane as well. And of course, environmental pollution drops with that. So we save far, far more of the environment that's out there. Just to remind you of those costs again about what T-tubes were, you can now start to see that there actually is quite a big cost difference between using these different circuits. To remind you of those costs, if we have a look from R6.50 to R2.20 to R58 just for isoflurane. And so if we can use circle systems and use them efficiently, you can in actual fact save a lot of money. But if we do use a circle system, by the way, we are going to use more soda lime. So there's an offset cost likely. What I can tell you is that the offset costs actually are fairly small. So you save a lot more than what you're going to spend on soda lime. Just remember, soda lime heats up, so it generates heat that is there, and it's usually got a little bit of sodium hydroxide in it. It acts as a catalyst, by the way. It's usually only a couple of percent. And what it does do is it makes the calcium hydroxide and calcium carbonate that's there far more effectively formed. So it just serves as a catalyst. The sodium hydroxide only briefly exists as sodium bicarbonate, and then that rapidly gets converted with the calcium hydroxide into calcium carbonate that's there. But it is a corrosive substance, and that's a very, very old glass soda lime canister that's there, and you can see how the glass has been pitted and damaged by soda lime over many, many years of usage. That also can destroy, if it gets onto your rubber seals, destroy your rubber seals. That can happen there, and you don't want your patient to breathe it in. So having a good quality soda lime is actually important to avoid that dust, because it is the sodium hydroxide in most of our soda lime is incredibly toxic to the circuits. But also remember that when you throw it away, most of it, if it's exhausted and used, it should be fairly safe to do it, but there's still a small amount of sodium hydroxide that can be an environmental contaminant and can be corrosive to things that you put it in, especially metals and so forth that are out there. Just remember this about circle systems, because how we use a circle system is different to a T-tube, because there's two things that are going to happen in a circle system that we need to be aware of. And one is dilution of the anesthetic agent, and the other is the time constant, or the rate at which the anesthetic agent concentration changes. And we need to be aware of that, because in a T-tube, if you change the anesthetic agent concentration, it changes instantaneously. That's it. If you set the dial to 3%, the air flows through, comes out the vaporizer 3%, your patient breathes 3%. That doesn't happen in a circle system at all. And this is really just a little diagrams of what happens. I just chose a 200 ml reservoir bag. You can't get one that size. The smallest is usually a ½ liter, but it's just for my purposes of showing it. So remember, the reservoir bag in a real circuit is a lot bigger. Our patient breathes 2% halothane in, is 200 mils. Our patient weighs 10 kilos, so he's going to breathe in 100 mils, and he breathes that all in. And so we're left with 100 mils in our reservoir bag, half his tidal volume, with 2% halothane in it. And then our patient starts to breathe out. And it doesn't matter that there's dead space gas, because that just flows around in the circle. Then he breathes out his alveolar gas, which contains some CO2. He's also absorbed, and I've just proposed that he's absorbed half the amount of anesthetic agent that was there. So there's 1% of the anesthetic agent that's there. As it goes through the soda lime, the CO2 is removed. And that means about 95 mils of gas returns to the reservoir bag. The anesthetic agent concentration goes up slightly because we've reduced the volume of gas that was there by 5 mils by removing the CO2. Goes into our reservoir bag, which had 2% halothane in it, 100 mils of that. And whilst our patient was breathing, another 5 mils of 2% halothane was added, because that's the amount of oxygen that he took out of the circuit. That, of course, all then mixes together again in the reservoir bag. And it means we've set the anesthetic agent vaporizer to 2% in this case, and our patient's only breathing 1.5% of the anesthetic agent. Dilutions happen. That's the first thing that takes place. And just remember, when a patient starts off an anesthetic, they absorb a lot more inhalation agent. So the dilution is in actual fact far bigger at the start of an anesthetic. It does take about 3 days to fully saturate with halothane, and none of us do an anesthetic that long. So most of our patients will not saturate with an anesthetic agent at all during our anesthesia that's there. So that's the first part we need to keep track of. The next part is time constants. And because we've got a circle system and we set a gas flow rate, there's air flowing in, it takes a certain amount of time for that volume of air to change once. And if we cause a change within concentration, it usually takes about 5 to 7 half-lives to get within 98% of our new target concentration. So if we take the vaporizer and we take it from 2 to 3%, it's going to take 5 to 7 half-lives to get within 98% of that 3% that we've set it to. And that's the same principle of drugs, by the way. So it takes 5 to 7 half-lives to get to steady state of a medication. So these principles of half-lives are fairly constant through medicine. So I've just started off in saying we have a 5-liter circuit volume. If you have a large dog, by the way, it's got a 3-liter reservoir bag. The soda lime canister often holds about 1 liter, so that gives you 4 liters. If you add on the volume inside the breathing circuits and all the other places, you can easily make up another liter. So we have a 5-liter circuit volume. We have a fresh gas flow running at 5 liters a minute. And that means it takes 5 minutes to exchange all the air once. So it takes 5 minutes to put 5 liters into that circuit. And 5 half-lives would then make it 25 minutes to get within that desired concentration that is there. So just think about this. When our patient wakes up or a patient is waking up or going to sleep, and we want to change the anesthetic concentration in the circuit, how quickly is it going to change? But 1 liter a minute is going to take us about 25 minutes. So if we took our vaporizer at 3%, turned it to 0%, by 25 minutes, there would be almost no isoflurane left in that circuit at that point. But our patient will wake up before that, by the way, because the anesthetic agent concentration steadily drops. Let's go to like a low flow circuit. The circuit's the same volume, still 5 liters. But now it takes 50 minutes for one time constant to happen, or 250 minutes, nearly 4 hours, for 5 half-lives to go away. So if we're running true low flow anesthesia, that time constant becomes incredibly long. So if your patient wakes up and you turn up the vaporizer only, it's going to take a long time for your patient to go to sleep. If you want the concentration of anesthetic agent to rise rapidly, by the way, you have to up the gas flow rate for all our machines. By the way, the modern generation now of human anesthetic machines that are coming out are fuel injected. I just refer to them as fuel injected. You screw the bottle of anesthetic agent onto the side, sucks the agent out. So if you set the vaporizer, or what we call the vaporizer, it's no longer, it's a fuel injection system, an anesthetic agent injection system, to 5% as a circuit concentration, and injects a volume of isoflurane into the expiratory side, will achieve 5% within the matter of a couple of seconds, literally. It's got fans that circulate. But we have old-fashioned vaporizers, so we don't get that advantage at all. So if you up the gas flow rate, by the way, to 5 liters, now the time constant's 1 minute. Now the anesthetic agent concentration rises incredibly rapidly. So now you can see a semi-closed circuit is actually quite useful for changing anesthetic depths. When a patient wakes up under anesthesia at not the right point, we can just up the gas flow rate, up the vaporizer percentage, and your patient will go to sleep. Or you want to wake him up at the end of an anesthetic. You can up the gas flow rate, turn off your vaporizer, and your patient will wake up really quickly. If they're in a low flow anesthetic or a closed circuit state, it's going to take a very, very long time. And that's really what I wanted to show you with this picture here, that in a circle system, I'm often clueless as to how much anesthetic agent this patient is breathing. That's just my agent analyzer and the Kaplan graph. So if you look at the expired percentage that's there, by the way, it's about 1.3, 1.2% the patient's breathing. If you pay careful attention, the vaporizer, by the way, is set to 3.5%. And the gas flow rate is running at low flow anesthesia. So in low flow anesthetics, you actually have to up your percentage to actually get to the desired MAC value for your patient. And sometimes I always have the saying as well, maybe we should just take all the numbers off a vaporizer and have on and off on it. That's there. Because in circle systems, we think, oh, it's at 3.5%. Well, our patients may not actually be breathing anywhere close to 3.5% in a circle system that's there. Remember, how do we do it practically? Do clinical depth of anesthesia. How deep's your patient? Go and check those neurological reflexes. Is he responding to surgery? Is he responding to the procedure? He's not responding to the procedure, he's not responding to the surgery. See how light you can get that patient, because it may actually result in differences in outcome. But using your vaporizer to guide anesthetic depth is flawed, because also remember there's a bell graph curve. So although we know the MAC value, that is there about 2%, just over 2% for isoflurane, for most of our patients that are going to sit there, 1 in 20 will get overdosed and 1 in 20 will get underdosed because of biological variation that's there in our patients. So the basis is check anesthetic depth. What about oxygen? Some of you use cylinders, and I'm sure some of you use oxygen concentrators. You can choose which one you want to do. And both are quite acceptable, by the way. If you have some of the high-tech equipment and some of those really high-tech anesthetic machines, they require high-pressure oxygen, just so that you know they will not work on an oxygen concentrator, because I call him Mr. Grumpy, but if Mr. Grumpy doesn't get 340 kilopascals line pressure, it just doesn't turn on. It laughs, and that's as far as he'll go until he gets 340 kilopascals. We don't have machines like that, but if you do, then you have only one choice that's out there. But most of us can actually use both. Of course, oxygen cylinders comes in a variety of cylinder sizes, and that's why I've got a cost of oxygen which can vary between 15 Rand 40 a litre down to 85 cents a litre, depending on the size, the volume you buy, where you buy it from, etc. That was out there. I'm just going to use the cheapest amount in all my calculations just to give you an idea that's out there. But it will depend, and just remember there's a cylinder rental fee that goes into this. Some of you may pay it, some of you may not. That's out there, but I think most of you are paying a cylinder rental fee as well. So that can be about 300 Rand a month included in that calculation that's there. Or you can use an oxygen concentrator, and its consumption, by the way, is electricity. And so if you work out that cost, it can be as low as about 6 cents a litre. And this is just based on my own home's Eskom electricity bill for the cost. They're often running somewhere around about 350 watts to about 750 watts is what oxygen concentrators will use, depending on the type and the volume and how many litres per minute it produces. But it gives you an idea of cost comparison. So now if we go back to those calculations, by the way, what's the cost to run a T-tube for an hour, a semi-closed circuit for an hour, or a closed circuit for an hour? Well, the cost can be very, very different, from 102 Rand if you're using a cylinder down to 3 Rand 82 using cylinders, by the way. So you can already see there can be a big cost saving on oxygen, especially if you use cylinders, just by using a closed circuit. And there's the rough difference between oxygen concentrators. Admittedly, 72 cents is not that expensive for a T-tube, but it can be as low as 3 cents for that whole hour that's out there, depending on the volume used. Unfortunately, it's a bit crooked, just so that you know, because oxygen concentrators do run all the time. So I've just worked out per litre. In other words, an oxygen concentrator, although it'll work slower, it's still using electricity in that time. So the cost would, in actual fact, real term, be slightly higher than that. That is there. But this is what Alan Clyde did. Here's his article about how he did it and his calculate. Oh, that jumped too quickly there. But just so you know, he worked on halothane, isoflurane, and methoxyflurane were his anesthetic techniques. They had a moderate flow technique, which wasn't closed. So it was quite a lot higher than closed. But you can see the number of moles of agent used, about 0.8 of a mil versus 10.5 mils or 11 or 12 mils that are sitting up there. You can see the big difference in agents that were used with it. They did, plus the cost differences that he calculated there, also the savings that they had on oxygen that was there. And that's how he came out to saying, if you did this from your first day, you went out to work and practice and worked for 40 years, and you put all that money that you saved into investments, you could land up with a whole lot more money at the end of the day for your hospital to retire on, as he put it. So there is a lot of validity that's out there. So we need to think about these things because there's a financial and environmental cost to what we do. And in humans now, they've gone to automated control. So you set an end tidal anesthetic agent concentration and off you go, and it runs, just so that you know. And what they could show is that there is potential savings by having more scientific equipment, using things like capnographs that were there. But if you're good at using a good anesthetic technique that's out there, you can still get considerable savings. What about the drugs that we're going to make our patient go to sleep with? So I've just put up here, this was a calculation I did a little while ago for another talk, thiopentone versus propofol. If you start to look in the different suppliers out there, there's not a massive cost difference in the induction drugs. Because although we've spoken about all the inhalation agents that are there, we still need our patient often to go to sleep because we don't do many inhalation inductions that are there. There's not a massive cost difference, by the way, in using thiopentone or propofol. When I first started practice, there was a big difference between the two. So we'd often use thio for induction and then go on with propofol maintenance to save costs. But if we do a TIVA technique, and propofol's the ideal drug because we can't use thiopentone. If you give thiopentone, your patient's going to take forever to wake up. Okay. And we just worked out the induction costs. By the way, the induction costs would always be constant. But if we did an hour of anesthesia, by the way, it's going to cost us about 15 Rand in propofol to maintain that anesthetic, with a total cost of around about 20 Rand for the drug. By the way, this doesn't include the oxygen, but it's just for the costs of the drug that are there. But you can see with that. So now if you start to remember back to what ISO and SIVO cost on closed circuits, well, that's more expensive. It's more expensive than closed circuit anesthesia. If you're using a T-tube, it's way cheaper than a T-tube to use TIVA for maintenance as far as anesthetic agents go. And that's really, if we start to look at it, how do we optimize these costs that go through there? And so they've tried many different things in people, by the way, including driving it by your BIS electrodes, which is a measurement of anesthetic depth, to say, is this more cost effective? And of course, here they use BIS electrodes, which adds $20 to the price, just so that you know. So it's 28 euros versus 9, just call it 10 euros. You take the BIS electrodes out for 90 minutes of anesthesia, it's sort of coming out at about the same time. That's there. But here's the effective gas flow, by the way. So your TIVA had a set cost, call it 37 euros there. That was there. That was your TIVA cost. If you use the high gas flow rate, in actual fact, TIVA started to become as cost effective or better than inhalation anesthetic. So you can see now that effect, that TIVA, somewhere around about between 1 to 2 liters per minute, crosses that line where TIVA becomes cheaper than inhalation anesthesia. So gas flow rate determines whether TIVA is cost effective or not. So if you're in a non-rebreathing circuit, total intravenous anesthesia is sometimes a lot cheaper for you than doing it. By the way, that doesn't mean don't use an anesthetic machine. Because an anesthetic machine, yes, it provides us with an anesthetic agent, but that's not the only thing it does. It controls ventilation, supplements oxygen, enables us to breathe for a patient, and does a whole lot of other things. It doesn't mean don't use an anesthetic machine. It's just how we maintain anesthesia that's there. And so this was a study done in South Africa a good couple of years ago where they looked at it, looking at inhalation anesthetics with isoflurane versus total intravenous anesthesia. And once again, you can see as gas flows increase, costs increase. And as time increases, by the way, it can have an influence on costs as well. So those are the factors that we need to think. How long is this procedure going to be? What agent are we going to use? And what is the most cost-effective approach for our patients? So just to start right towards the end here, to bring all of this back together again, Just to remind you of the cost, closed circuit ISO was about R2.20, semi-closed was about R6.59, TIVA was R14.69, that's just for the maintenance component, and a semi-open like a T-tube was about R60 worth of ISO that was there. What does this mean? Well, what happens if you did 3 hours of anesthetics a day, 5 days a week, for 52 weeks of the year, with a cost difference between the cheapest to the most expensive, about R56. That cost difference is about 43,000, 44,000 Rand in a year. Just what the cost or the extra cost of maintenance of anesthesia is going to be. As I say, in order to do closed circuit anesthesia, you need to have a circuit that seals. So this is one way of paying your machine off. By the way, if you look at the oxygen concentrator, and I just used 0.5 liters per minute with the differences in the gas flow rate. So in other words, I didn't go down to the 75 mils that I had inside that. The cost difference is about 19,000 Rand a year. And that can easily pay, by the way, for an oxygen concentrator and pay a fair portion of an anesthetic machine just purely on savings that is out there. And so there are ways for us to, in actual fact, change our anesthetic equipment and update it without it costing us a lot of money. In actual fact, by saving us money, we can actually start to pay these machines off that are there. Just remember, our drug choices and our other drugs work exactly the same way. And I'm not going to go through all of cost economics because I can't, but just how we use drugs and which type of analgesics we choose does have cost implications for our patients and our clients. This is just always comparing fentanyl and morphine that is out there, but you can see the cost difference. If you're using fentanyl for analgesia and we need to use a concentrate infusion because of its short half-life to maintain anesthesia, you can get a massive difference in cost. And that just gives you an idea of the cost range between different suppliers and different drugs that are out there, just to give you an idea of that. And just by the way, in case you're worried about treating nausea, some people, morphine, both can cause nausea, by the way, but you do get slightly more nausea with morphine. The cost of preventing nausea is somewhere between 50 and 100 Rand. It does make it more cost efficient for your client. And these are things to think about, especially when you're fitting the bill because you're doing it for a fixed price or you work in welfare versus when your client's paying for it. If your client's paying for it, it doesn't really affect you. It just affects their pocket that's out there. And with that, I've got to the end of my talk that's out there. I'll go and have a look for questions now, and then we can start to answer those questions that are there. Oh, wait, there we go. I just need to do this. Stop sharing. There we go. Right. That is there. Oh, I'm just trying to load the questions. Comments. There we go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kenneth, for your wonderful talk. And dear daughters, I'm sure all of you may have a lot of questions for Dr. Kenneth. So it's time for QA. Please feel free to type in the chat room or in the QA module. We have 5 minutes for you to type the questions. If you don't have questions, we will go to the next part and then we will finish our webinar today.
Yeah. If people don't have questions, you can do your part. We can always come back to them right at the end as well. But yeah, we'll just keep track and see if people do ask.
Yes. We will wait for 5 minutes for typing the questions.
Oh, there we go. Somebody has asked a question. What is the lowest supply of oxygen concentrator to use with an anesthetic machine? That's from Christelle. So just remember that an oxygen concentrator, what it essentially usually consists is 2 compression chambers. They're filled usually with a substance called zeolite, which absorbs or preferentially absorbs nitrogen. So if you actually listen to an oxygen concentrator, what it does do is it compresses one vessel whilst it's releasing oxygen from the other vessel that's inside it. Okay. And it knows that when the pressure drops to a certain point, then the percentage of nitrogen rises. So they don't ever deliver 100% pure oxygen, but they're often sitting on an average range above 90%, somewhere around about 95%, but it can drop to as low as 88% on some machines that are there. So what it does do is it waits for a certain pressure drop. That's often how they cycle. When that happens is it vents that side. But what it does do is it then starts releasing oxygen from the other chamber. So it cycles between the two chambers on a continual basis. That is there. And so you can release oxygen flow out of there, by the way, at 100 mils a minute. The oxygen concentrators, some of them will battle because an alarm will go off because of resistance that it's getting. So it just depends on how they set up. That's there. But there's always this thing because there's a whole lot of monitoring stuff running and then the compressor will run. So if you actually listen to them, you can hear them switching over between one side to the other. But it actually depends on how the algorithm is set up. But you can get oxygen concentrators which will go down to fairly low flow rates that are out there. That it is often people set them to a minimum flow of 500 mils a minute, but they're actually not designed, the ones we use specifically for anesthesia, they're designed for home oxygen supplementation. So they're often targeted at a minimum flow rate of around about 1 liter a minute. That's what they expect to deliver. So they don't set them very, very sensitive, if I can put it to you that way, with the oxygen concentrate. But it does depend. But most of your machines will tell you, if you go and read the back of the instruction manual, we don't always do that, by the way, just so that you know, we'll actually give you those percentages, the accuracy, the flow rates at which they were tested. That's there. That is there, yeah. So yes, you can use them, and they are useful for us to do that. Just do that. Right. That's there. There we go. Ah, now I can see myself again. I had the question there. Right. Are there any other questions that people have? Going through the chat. Right. Janet, I don't know whether you want to play your part, and then we'll just see if there's questions afterwards.
Okay, sorry, I need to share some information, so sorry to disturb you.
No.
Okay, so yeah, on the screen, dear doctors, you can see this is our South African local distributor. Now is selling our dental unit and our anesthesia machine. If you have any quotation requirement, please kindly you can visit their website shown here, or you can just like contact them through their contact information sharing on their website. Thank you.
Okay, right. Stefan's just asked, does the oxygen concentrate have to be set at the same flow rate as the flow meter on the anesthetic machine? So it depends on your setup. Most of us, as I say, use supplemental things. You can open that valve fully and control your flow rate with your flow meter on your anesthetic machine. So just remember that if you set your oxygen concentrator to 1 liter a minute, that's going to be your peak flow, but often the resistance will slow down that flow through that flow meter. Some oxygen concentrators have an issue with what I'd call back pressure. In other words, they have an alarm. So if you kink a line, you get back pressure on it, and therefore the machine's designed to alarm, because then you as a patient are not getting oxygen at all. So it just depends on the design. When you get a whole incorporated machine, so there are some machines that have the oxygen concentrator thing, is effectively you're controlling oxygen flow out of the flow meter that's on the device. But often when I use machines is I set the oxygen concentrator to its peak flow, and then I use the flow meter on the anesthetic machine to control that flow. Okay. Somebody asked about maintenance of anesthetic machines. So maintenance is an interesting an interesting part, because modern vaporizers, by the way, are often bought nowadays with a service interval of 5 years and some even out to 10 years that are there, depending on the vaporizer you get. So the old halothane vaporizers, because of thymol in them, used to accumulate in the vaporizer, and of course that damaged the vaporizer. So there's essentially two little plates that sit on the old design of vaporizers, just so that you know, and they integrate together. There's no greases in a vaporizer, because just remember, if you expose a petrochemical grease to oxygen, it can combust, spontaneously combust. So there's no grease in that, but the thymol is like a crystalline, oily type substance that used to build up inside the vaporizer. So you often see a greenish tinge on the wicks or inside the window that was there. So they required maintenance on a regular basis every year to get rid of the thymol that was inside there, that it is there. Then you've got all the other components to it, by the way, and that's a different thing. So you should check your anesthetic machine, as I say, certainly on a daily basis, to make sure that there's no leaks on it, that it is there. I check the what I call the preparation phase, so your flow meters, vaporizer, up to your common gas outlet. If you do that daily and you pick up problems, then you are going to have it serviced. The rest is to check for calibration, and it's worthwhile checking that your vaporizer is still accurate on a yearly basis. So in other words, it's not really a services, if I can put it to you that way. You go and check for leaks and all those other type of things on a yearly basis. And you know, if you maintain your machines, you're not often going to encounter leaks, but it's to check that there's nothing else that causes drifts. So there are components in a vaporizer which can go. The most valuable part of a vaporizer, by the way, is the thermostat, which controls how its temperature output is put in. Its most difficult part to set, that it is there. So there are things that affect the vaporizer output, or things or parts that can go. Just remember, the temperature is often a bimetallic strip, so it expands and contracts based on heat. That's there, so it is moving, if I can call it that, very small amounts of movement, but you do get cyclical fatigue. So components like that can break in the longer term. So check your calibration in your whole machine on an annual basis. That would be there, and check your machine that it's actually working every day. That is there. I'm just moving this down. Sorry. That it is there. Laura asked, where is it, Laura? Do oxygen concentrators ever need any form of maintenance? The answer is yes, they do. So the most common maintenance that we need to do on it is their filters. So some of them will have two filters in line. One is I'm going to call it a dog hair filter, because that's what it does. It's a big macroscopic filter, usually made of sort of like often plasticky type, synthetic type materials that takes out all the gross dirt in it. And then they usually have a type of HEPA filter, which is very much like the filter you have in your carburetor for a car, sort of a paper type filter that filters. So they have that, and those need to be paced regularly. And often the HEPA filter, the dust filter, as they call it, or that outside air filter, you should clean on a regular basis. Like every time you see it gets dirty, but certainly on a monthly or weekly basis, you can clean that. And the HEPA filter is often changed on the number of hours that the machine has done. So it will last, I'm going to say 1,000 hours or 500 hours. They'll tell you how often to replace it. But the other thing is, you can just go and look at it. If you're working in really dusty, dirty environments, those HEPA filters get dirty very, very quickly, and you can see them. Just like a carburetor filter, you can see how dirty they get. And as they get dirty, of course, they create resistance, which means the machine sucks against resistance that it is there. So yes, so it does depend on your machine, but they do require maintenance that's out there. The rest of the compressors and so on don't require as much maintenance that's out there. But the things that we do commonly is changing filters and making sure they clean. Marcel asks, what's the best way to get moisture out of a breathing circuit between anesthetic machines and patients? The humans have it easy, Marcel. What they do is one circuit, one patient, and then that's done. So they don't have that issue that's there. So the things that help you reduce that moisture, you get HME filters. So you can put an HME filter between your patient, by the way, and the ET tube. And an HME filter will precipitate out a lot of that moisture for you. Okay. What it does do is it also helps your patient, by the way, that is there, because by having the HME filter that's there, it also helps them save heat because you're humidifying the gas as it comes through into your patient that is there. So that's one way of doing it. The other thing is to have a few circuits so that you can hang them up and let them dry out between patients that it is there. At OP and still today, the one-way valves, often the expiratory side is the side where most of the moisture generates. And to drain it, clean it, and dry it out, sometimes you need to dismantle those valves. And if you do it every day and reassemble it the next day, it'll often dry out overnight. That is there. So that's another thing you can do. You'll notice that in T-tubes, you often don't get a lot of moisture at all. And that's because of the high gas flow rate. So in low flow anesthesia, by the way, you're going to get a lot more moisture accumulation in your circuit that it is there. But the most practical and easiest way to deal with it is often through HME type filters that are there. All right. Are there any other questions that you can see? I think I've answered all of these. By the way, I don't know if, yeah, there we go. That's, right. That is there. Okay. Right. So are there any other questions that are there? Are there anything? I see Henry's asked, with oxygen constant generators, do you need to empty the water tanks when using with the anaesthetic machine? I'm trying to think what you're referring to. So in other words, is there an accumulation of moisture within the compression vessels of the oxygen concentrator? That is possible, by the way, but they do vent all the time. So that is there. So they're actually venting quite a lot of nitrogen with each time that they go out. So it does take a fair amount and they get warm. I've never seen it as a problem, and they haven't created. So if you look at like your dental compressors and that, they often have a water trap system to get rid of water. So you compress the gas into the chamber, it then cools down and you slowly release it. I've never actually seen it as a problem. Now I almost feel as though I don't know the answer to that question. I'll have to go and have a look again, Henry, to see what I can find out about them. But if water accumulated, they would have designed water traps into them and had a system to vent the water out, which I've never seen yet on an oxygen concentrator. They do happen if you, by the way, if you buy big commercial oxygen concentrators, they can produce 340 kilopascals pressure, by the way, so they can make Mr. Grumpy happy by one machine. They have water traps on them and you have to vent them, but they've got massive compression chambers that are there. But I'll see if I can find out any other information for you that is there.
Thanks again, Dr. Kenneth. And this brings us to the end of today's webinar. If you need more information, you can either send us an email or follow our social media accounts and also our distributor, Longman Medical. We are happy to help. And our logo of our social media is showing in such a screen. And we will announce our next academic on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk.
Yes, thank you so much. We will finish. Thank you all. Bye. Have a nice day. Good evening.
Bye.
Bye.